Hello students of English and welcome to Excel at English, which is a channel devoted to helping you achieve excellence in the analysis of English language and literature. In this video we will be exploring the political contexts of The Handmaid's Tale as part of a series focused on the text aimed at students of the AQA English Language and Literature course, but more broadly valuable to anyone who needs to study the text, particularly at A level or maybe at undergraduate level, or perhaps anyone who just loves context and analysis of literature. Please check the playlist for other videos in this series, and if what you want isn't there, then you can subscribe or put a request in comments for me. So, let's look at some of the underlying political contexts in this video lesson that are beneath the surface of The Handmaid's Tale. To begin with, let's take it back to the religious roots of American society and consider the Puritans. The Puritans were a religious group in Europe. They were a Protestant religious group in the 16th and 17th century, and they argued for a very pure interpretation of Christianity based on a strict interpretation of the Bible. That wasn't the way that 16th and 17th century Europe, and particularly Britain, worked. There were still many Catholic elements in the way that Christianity was practiced in British society at that time, and the Puritans were deeply opposed to this. So we have a religious conflict within British society. The Puritans opposed any kinds of sexual freedom, and they, so much so, they tried to ban entertainment such as dancing and the theatre. Their society enforced very strict expectations for women, and those expectations were based around childbearing and child raising. For the Puritans, the family was the central unit of a society, and of course the man was at the head of that family. The Puritans fled their persecution in Europe, and many of them travelled across the ocean to America to begin a new and freer society. And these new settler societies were essentially theocratic in nature. They were ruled by religious law, and they sought the Bible, or they sought to turn to the Bible when looking for guidance as to how their society should be run. If you're interested in finding out more about American Puritan society, the play The Crucible, Miller's play The Crucible, is a fantastic example of Puritan society in 17th century America. It's based on the Salem witch trials, and it explores the power of religious hysteria. It also explores themes such as hypocrisy, and contains a very interesting view of the way that women are presented in society at that time. Let's bring it right forward to within a lifetime of the present and to the 1970s. In 1970s American society, there were a great many progressive social changes, and it was a positive time for feminists, or for those generally seeking equality of the sexes and progressive change. These second wave feminists of the 1970s, they viewed society as fundamentally biased against women, and they sought to oppose what they saw as this sort of social discrimination. They attacked male norms in society and fought for greater representation of women. Within this feminist movement, there were issues like pornography, which were hotly debated, and became, if you like, a kind of a hot potato, a debate that's very, very difficult to hold. Feminism was flourishing at this time as an intellectual movement, both in literature and in academic debate. And the results were great. Throughout the 70s, a number of decisive political victories were won. Rights, property rights, employment rights, and so on and so forth. And women gradually felt that they were starting to establish themselves as a more equal partners in a freer and more open society. And this culminates in, or one of the key moments, I suppose, in the liberalism of the 1970s is the court judgment of Roe versus Wade. And in the United States, this court judgment establishes a precedent, establishes a new law in favour of abortion as a constitutional right. And this was something that feminists had fought very passionately for, based on the idea that a woman's body is her own, and that control of her own child-rearing capabilities is a fundamental right for women. This was as we'll see, is a very controversial decision in American law, and one that certainly has not gone away in the modern day. There's a good suggestion here for reading, wider reading, if you read the New York Times interview with Atwood at about the time that The Handmaid was published. It's called No Balm in Gilead. You can find it on Google. It's quite insightful as Atwood explains her own take on the social factors behind The Handmaids. In the 1980s, there is a backlash against these progressive victories of feminism in the 1970s. And the backlash comes in the form of this socially conservative movement that we can broadly describe as the New Right. The New Right really includes religious and traditionalist groups, and they want to reverse what they saw as a kind of moral corruption. These groups are deeply hostile to women's rights, or perhaps more correctly, have a very different conception of what women's rights are. They're sceptical about environmental science and evolution, and they, like the Puritans before them, are opposed to all sexual freedoms. They view the traditional family as the central unit of society, and you often find family values used as a phrase to describe the core belief of the New Right. To go along with this, or an aspect of the New Right that is worth being aware of, is religious revival movements. And these are immensely popular and immensely powerful churches fronted by celebrity preachers known as televangelists. These sorts of churches that gained immense wealth and political power start to become politically involved in terms of telling their congregations who to vote for, which gives them massive political influence. And gradually we start to see the New Right mixing religion and politics. And this was a real concern to people within the progressive movement. This is still a kind of an ideological conflict in society as to whether people believe that politics and religion should be separate or whether they belong together. Depends on your viewpoint. So Atwood is writing The Handmaid's Tale against this kind of social ideological conflict between progressive, liberal, intellectual feminism and traditional family values fronted by televangelism and mainly the Republican Party in the US. So overall, in the 1980s, as the New Right rises, writers and intellectuals like Atwood are starting to feel that the progress made in the 1970s is under threat, and that there is a risk of it being undone, or even worse, society going back even further and taking away even more rights that were hard fought for. Finally then, some other contextual factors in the 1980s that have traces of influence in The Handmaids. The AIDS virus spread during the 1980s, as you can see from the headline, the cover page of Time magazine there. And this was a sexually transmitted disease that spread initially amongst the gay community. And it wasn't really very well understood, and it caused a huge social hysteria. There were forces within the New Right who sought to portray the AIDS crisis or the AIDS virus as a kind of divine punishment for sin, particularly as it affected initially affected among the gay community in America, which was sort of seized upon as a piece of political opportunism by those who were ideologically opposed to that kind of sexual freedom. But those on the right also opposed contraception, or opposed contraception because they opposed any kind of sexual freedom, and they saw contraception as being responsible for a decline in birth rate and the corruption of traditional family values, because if you can take the pill, then I guess you can kind of sleep around, which is something that they saw as a form of moral corruption in society. The AIDS virus and its and the anxiety caused by that, we could probably trace that in the fertility crisis premise of The Handmaid's Tale. We've also got constant war, or kind of this ongoing background war, the Cold War in the 1980s, formed between two ideologically opposed superpowers, the Soviet Republic, the USSR, and the USA, and these two silently warring superpowers are accumulating massive amounts of nuclear weapons, enough that could destroy the world many times over. The Cold War never becomes an out-and-out conflict between the USA and the USSR. Instead, it becomes a kind of a global conflict fought through proxy wars in places like Vietnam and Korea. That means these countries supporting smaller countries, or conflicts within smaller countries. And this became a kind of a global ideological divide. But it was, I guess, a utopian view of the world that both of these ideologies took. Both capitalism and communism promised a kind of utopian society to their followers. If you just follow our political doctrine, we will lead you to a form of social perfection. So there's this fear in society on both sides of the other side. And it's a kind of an ideologically pure society that these two superpowers are trying to create. However, in the 1980s, the media is becoming more powerful. After Vietnam in the 70s, people in the US started to realise actually that their politicians didn't always have their best interests at heart. They started to question whether the ideologies of capitalism and communism were genuinely going to lead to these perfect societies, and they became disillusioned, and their politicians on both sides were revealed as being hypocrites. Atwood, of course, is writing in this context when she writes of a Gilead that is at war, where she writes of propaganda of foreign conflicts in which the media is representing their side as morally justified and winning the war. Certainly those elements of Handmaid reflect very strongly in the politics of the 1980s. And finally, the environmental aspect to the Handmaids. We don't know what's caused the environmental catastrophe that is a kind of a sub-theme to the Handmaid's Tale. But in the 1980s, things like the greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse effect and global warming are starting to become understood. And society generally is starting to get this very dystopian anxiety, if you like, about the idea that humans have the potential to destroy or damage the Earth. Not just through nuclear war, but also through nuclear disaster in a place like Chernobyl, or through the ongoing pollution of the Earth. Okay, so that's quite a lot of information. You could always pause the video and catch up, but here's a quick summary of some of the points covered. We looked at the Puritan roots of American society and how possibly some of those powerful religious forces in society are reflected in the modern in this conflict between progressive feminism and the resurgent new right. And we've also covered some of those social anxieties of the 1980s, such as anxieties about disease through the AIDS crisis, nuclear war and the ideological clash of superpowers, and the potential for environmental catastrophe. That's all for this video lesson. If you found it useful, please click to give a like and show your appreciation, leave a comment or leave me a request, or just say hey. Take a look at the channel page to see what else is in the playlist and check as new videos appear. Thank you again for watching Excel at English, and most of all, good luck with your studies.